This is a very exciting time for people like me because change always gets your attention. Now, this is somewhat challenging change that we're looking at, but I think as we start thinking about the next few years, we have to understand where we've come from and where we're going, and those are two different places. The Washington area economy is in the midst of a significant sea change. I use that term. You probably all know what it means. I'm a sailor, and so I know particularly what it means. But the sea change, or it's more than a transition because it's more abrupt than that, is the culmination or maybe combination of what we've gone through the last 4 or 5 years through a very deep and long recession and slow recovery. I want to talk just a little bit about that period. It's quite long now. It dates back to the beginning of 2008. 5 years of turmoil, in a sense. And it's been compounded further by the changing role of the federal government as the principal driver of the local economy and a major employer. And this sets in motion the future. So that's sort of the plan. I have to remember to turn on my tool here. So where did we start? Oh, there's my title, I'm sorry. So let's move on. So we are the 4th largest metropolitan area in the country. It's good to get some perspective. You all know that New York is pretty big. This is not measured by population, but by economies. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington. These are the 15. You don't have to know what they are, but you can see where we position. Over the first part of the last decade, sort of moving into the recession, we were the best performing. Again, these are just sort of mindsets to take with you. 4th largest, best performing. Theoretically, or as one might measure recessions, we've really never had one that you can point to hard times and to slowdowns, but we've never really gone negative. We went negative in this region in 2009. The National Recession, you're all aware, was just terrible. It was worse than everybody expected. Most of the efforts to deal with it weren't sufficient, not because they were poorly designed. You could argue whether they were correctly managed or designed, but they just weren't enough for the depth of the problem that was confronting the economy. Nobody knew how bad it was at that time. So I'm just focusing on the V, if you can see the V. All parts of this region suffered. As we looked at the performance of the economy, though, I said it was the best leading up to the recession. It was also the best during the recession. That's us way over there on the yellow bar on the far part of the screen. This of course, this period, 07 to 10, included going into the recession and coming out of it. But I use this to establish the context that the kind of an economy we're used to has been somewhat counter-cyclical, and it's been cushioned. We've outperformed the nation in good times and in bad times. Not as bad here as other places in hard times. We had this is jobs now, as we can think of this maybe measured. It's how I think about the economy usually, and not output or the value of what we do, but jobs. That's what seems to count. 17 months of job losses. The nation had 27 months. Ours were pretty deep there for a while, but we came back faster than anybody else, and we had a pretty good beginning. We had a little slow spot in the middle of 11. I'll come back to that. In the first year of the recovery, we were the only metropolitan area showing much life. Yeah, there's another blue bar on there. That's Boston. And Dallas actually was sort of hovering with growth. We were the first one to start recovering. So this message of being blessed in a way, of having a very vital economy, continued in through 10. The whole country had a slow start. The next year, that's 11. We weren't the best performing anymore. we're doing okay. 32,000 jobs isn't bad. And of course, if we think of this in terms of our size, we were outperforming Chicago because they're a lot bigger than we are. But just in raw numbers, you get the sense that the hand we were dealt is beginning not to serve us quite as well, and we can look back and see some of the consequences already emerging. When we look at how we have performed since we started growing, we led the pack. In April of 10, we were the only metropolitan area adding jobs. We are no longer at the top of the list. This takes us all of 2011 and up through September of this year. We're not at the top of the list. In 2011, by the way, Detroit added more jobs than we did. Our economy didn't have what was recovering to the extent that Detroit had in its economy what was recovering. That was manufacturing. Here we are. You know, we were an A-plus economy back there in the 00 to 05 period, which included a recession. This is sort of a B-minus economy at this point. It's okay. It just isn't leading the pack any longer. It's quite remarkable. Now what? This is how we're doing right now. This isn't bad. We're doing better right now than I thought we'd be doing. I almost don't believe some of the numbers until we see how they shake out at the end of the year. But clearly a lot of places are doing better. The tallest bar other than New York is Houston, and followed by Los Angeles. Both those are very diversified economies. We think of Houston as being maybe petrochemicals, and of course it does have a lot of oil and energy there, but they have a very large health component and education component in their economies. We do too. They make something of it. We sort of in denial sometimes, not we in this room, but the leadership of the region doesn't understand where its strengths are. It hasn't focused yet. It will, I hope. We're doing all right, but we're clearly not leading the pack anymore. And when we look at what is happening, what kind of jobs, of these 41,000 jobs, that's from a year ago. That's a year's worth of job growth, September to September. I begin to see some, and you can't read this, but let me tell you what's important here. First, I see, yes, the federal government's losing jobs. That's a yellow flag on the track. Wholesale trades down at the bottom, I don't know what's going on there. Information services, that's media. That's a structural change that's been going on for 10 years. It's the media. We saw in the Washington Post some of the problems in the Washington Post announced today, and a new editor. But it's also AOL and the kinds of firms that provide us information. They're using technology to replace workers. So that happens. Retail bothers me a little bit because it's growing nationally and it isn't growing here. We're spending more money for retail. And it isn't that we're buying more online. Maybe we are, and we're buying more through catalogs. I think it's that the retail sector is feeling a lot of competition. The best retail companies come here because we're considered to be a very strong market for retail sales. And so we get overserved in some ways. They have to be competitive. They're hiring part-time workers to replace full-time workers. So there are these kind of more subtle changes that you don't notice. The employment data that you hear in the newspaper, the stuff that everybody that moves markets, is all about full-time employment. They don't count part-time employment in these numbers. They're left out. Self-employment also is not included in the numbers that are reported by the Department of Labor. That's okay. These are the full-time regular jobs with whatever benefits we get these days. And you know, these are a good measure of the regular economy, but it looks like retail isn't participating. It has important implications to that workforce. The blue stuff is what I'm looking at. And what it tells me is that most of the sectors in the Washington area are poised for growth. They've right-sized, they've leaned themselves out, they've laid off the workers they're going to lay off, they've substituted technology for the workers where they can. They've gotten smart about, that's how you survive downturns and slow recoveries. But what's most troubling is the two top categories in this chart. If you can read those, that has been what has driven this economy. Professional and business services, 700,000 jobs. All of those add up to 3 million. So 700,000 in one category is really big. Those are the white collar, we used to call them white collar jobs. I'm not sure what we call them anymore, but they tend to work in office buildings. Really important in the district and sort of inside the Beltway, maybe out in Rockville and you know, the major employment centers, Tyson's and so forth. 11,000 isn't bad. It ought to be 25. For an economy that's producing 41,000 jobs, that sector ought to be 2 or 3 times as big as it is. It is the average salary in that sector's around 100,000. The next sector is our next biggest one, the federal government, 378,000 jobs. Average salary is a little over 100,000. That's 35% of all the jobs are underperforming. That has been our bread and butter for the last who knows how many decades. That's what's driven growth for 30 years. We've added high value added jobs, and it's supported a whole bunch of other jobs below those in retail and consumer services. It sort of kept the rest of the economy moving ahead. And we've begun to look more like other economies now. We have income compression. We're adding more lower salary jobs than we're adding higher salary jobs. The dog is wagging the tail now. And it has enormous long-term consequences. You don't see it. There was a report that came out last week for the first time in I don't know how many decades, first time that I know, the federal payroll went down here. Not very much, not adjusted for, with no adjustment for inflation. So the down is bigger than that in terms of purchasing power. It went down about 0.6%. And it wasn't because we lost 4,000 or 3,000 jobs. We haven't lost many jobs yet. Cuts are going to be larger. It's because we've had a wage freeze for 2.5 years. We'll go on to 3. That cuts into purchasing power. But more importantly, another not so subtle change, because we can see it, but we actually don't pay as much attention to it until it knocks on our door, is that we have a growing, accelerating number of retirees leaving this workforce. And the federal government's a little even more age sensitive in this regard, or top-end loaded. Those jobs are being replaced by persons with less pay. You lose somebody from your office who's been working there for 30 years and you replace them with somebody, not quite replace them, but you fill that vacancy, maybe move somebody up internally. They may not get paid quite as much as the person who left, and then they're replaced by somebody that gets a little less pay. So this generational shift from Generation Y moving in and the baby boomers moving out has an enormous economic impact on this region, because our top end has been very well paid. So there's some subtle changes. I see the economy poised to grow. If there's a stimulus to help it along, it's ready. But there's some erosion at the top that's going to have some consequences. The unemployment levels are quite comfortable here. They're still double what they were before the recession. We go around the Beltway, and it isn't a bad story, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And I alert you to this. And I can't help you too much in this regard, except to remind you that our economy is bifurcated. There's an academic word for you, but it tells me, it has these two big groups. We have a lot of people making $90,000 and more, not quite 40%. We have a whole bunch of people making about 50%, making less than 50. We have about 10% in between there. We have the middle has gone away. And so we start characterizing the average as 60, but there's nobody there. I mean, that isn't quite true, but I mean, you could get this in your mind, that we have a big support workforce. And we have this other workforce that's been generating the cash to support the workforce. And they've pulled further and further apart, and now the top end isn't growing anymore. Has a message, and there's going to be an effect on this other piece, but you see it on the unemployment rates. If you don't have a high school education, your unemployment rate is over 15%. If you have a high school education, but that's all, it's 10. If you have a college education, it's 4. So and we can do this geographically, we can do it ethnically, we can, we can do it by gender, by age. So the average looks good, but the average doesn't describe anybody. That's the problem with statistics. I got in trouble not too long ago. Politico was doing a piece that they wanted to say something about me, and they said that I was quoted as saying, you can prove anything with statistics. Well, you can. I mean, we just been through elections. We know. You just pick the one. The statistics aren't wrong, but you have to look behind them. So this isn't bad. We rank well in the country. This says our economy's pretty good, and that's where we're going from. And now, where are we going to? This is where we're going from. I'm getting ahead of myself here. That's our economy, or that's what it was in 10. It's changed just a little bit. And you can't see this, but all that light gray and speckled stuff, that's federal spending. It's 40% of our economy. So if you start with, and this is before any multipliers, this is just where does the money come from that goes into our economy every pay period. 40% was federal in 2010. You and me, we're all in that red box over there. We're the local serving pieces. That's government, it's the not-for-profits, it's the retail, it's your doctors and your dentists. It's everybody that basically depends on other sectors bringing new money into the region to spend. We have international, we have hospitality. That's the thing, if you can see, it says HOSP. That's in hospitals, that's hospitality. Health and education, a growing segment. We have something that I don't know what it is exactly. And local business, non-local businesses, those are businesses that do business here because it's a great place to do business, but they don't depend on the federal government. Not too many of those. Used to be a bigger sector. We are a one-horse town. We've been riding a racehorse who's now about 30 years old, and he's stumbling around the track. This is not a Kentucky Derby kind of horse anymore. And we're looking for new horses to ride. So, what's shaping the economy now as we go forward? I got a couple of categories here. So the first one is the employment structure has changed. I've already alluded to that, but this tells you how it changed during the last 5 years. All that red stuff are losses. They add up to 143,000 jobs. All of the blue stuff are gains. They add up to 114. If that's your checking account, you're in trouble. I can put an end date on there. It's October 12. But the beginning date is when they started losing. And some of that, a lot of that was in 08. Some of it was in 09. The only pieces that are incorrect and that you have to read in reverse are state and local government and federal government, because they gained during the recession, they lost after the recession. But I've just put them there to think about, look at all those red bars and look at the corresponding blue bars. Everything at the bottom of our economy, those are the smaller sectors. These are in reverse order. The top has the most jobs, the bottom has the least. It ranges from about 700,000 to 65. All of the bottom of our economy basically is stuck in the mud. It's not going in. It lost workers, and it hasn't begun to replace them. That is scary. I mean, we ought to be more diversified instead of less diversified. And then we look at construction. Well, we are building buildings again, at least apartment buildings. That's going to improve. That's sort of like a cylinder in your car that hasn't started firing very well yet. It's going to help us in 14 and 15. Leisure and hospitality, it's been doing quite well, but it hasn't replaced the jobs it lost. And within these bars, the gains and the losses aren't the same. We've been adding food service jobs. We lost, let's say, hotel jobs. I don't know that that's, I know we've been adding food service jobs because all the young people can't cook and they eat out every night. Yeah, try to get to a restaurant without a reservation. You see all these young people, they don't know how to cook. Retail trade, now that really frightens me. Health and education, that's the only, never lost jobs, grew every single month, nationally and locally, right on through the recession. That's the future. That's one of the horses that we're going to be riding going out of here. The average pay in that sector is less than 1/2 the average pay in professional business services. You have to have 2 jobs there to replace every one at the top that you don't get. So a job isn't a job. We know that, but you got to be reminded every once in a while that, you know, this, man, it's great. I like education and health. It's my business. There are lots and lots of old people, and I need lots and lots of health. There's lots and lots of young people, and I need a lot of education. This is the business to be in. So I tell anybody that asks me, what should I prepare in my future career? It doesn't matter whether you're an architect, design hospitals, or healthcare facilities, or schools, or an accountant. You know, or if you're doing philanthropy, work on education and health. There's lots of business to. But you know, you can't design an economy entirely around that. The federal government, we've added a lot of jobs. We haven't lost them yet, but we're going to see some erosion, and I'll show you that in a minute. Professional business services, this is where all the federal contractors are. This has been our bread and butter. These are cutting edge knowledge workers, technology intensive, whatever you want to call them. These are really what has distinguished the Washington area economy from everybody else. It's our manufacturing sector in a sense. And we've replaced all the jobs we lost. Unfortunately, we haven't replaced the same jobs and at the same level, and it's slowing down. So this is just the private sector. I took government out of it. It doesn't change much, except the numbers at the top changed. So we're down 209, and we've added 123. This is what we're going to rely on in the future, because the government isn't going to be there in the way it has in the past to drive job growth. This is professional business services. It had a short recession here. We lost quite a few jobs. We've gotten them back, as we've just seen. We had a slowdown at the beginning of this year, a little disquieting there, but it's come back, except look at the far right-hand side of that chart. It's your left hand for you guys. That's what we were doing earlier in the decade, last decade. 25, 27, 29,000. When this economy is running on all cylinders, we're getting 3/4 of our job growth, or 2/3 of our job growth out of professional and business services, and it makes everything else much easier. And now we're getting 15, 20%. So we've shifted. And there's government. Boy, if you want to see the handwriting on the wall, that's federal government, 18 months of losses. They're not big. This is attrition. These are people retiring and not being rehired. The agencies aren't backfilling their jobs. If you want to understand what might be an advanced effect of the threat of sequestration, federal agencies are keeping some options open. They don't know yet whether they're going to have to lay off more workers and how many that might be next year. It's 58 days or 57 days from today is the day, if you're counting. And so they're keeping some of their payroll money unspent until they know. It's only 4,000 jobs about, but it's the beginning. I'll show you. So we've had a structural change that is unfavorable to the top end, to what we are known for and what we do best. The federal government's part of that story, but it's worse. And so I want to talk about sequestration just for a minute. But the image that I want you to think, if you just think of these three numbers, or four numbers for a minute, we have 4.7% of the U.S. population. We get 9% of all of the federal money spent in the country, and that includes all of the entitlement programs. That's everything, 9%. We get 15% of all the DOD money. If we look at what is subject to sequestration, we get 21% of that. 21 cents of every dollar the federal government spends in the United States for payroll or procurement that's subject to sequestration is here. That's an enormous risk. So that's what that 21%, if you can see it way at the bottom of this column on your right. And if we equate that to jobs, it's 450,000 jobs in 2013. 65,000 of those right off the top are federal workers out of 378 or whatever we have now, under 380. 97,000 of them are federal procurement employees. They're for federal contractors. As soon as they pull the switch, whatever they do, won't be on the 2nd of January, but say by the 1st of April, if they go through with this, it takes a while for it to actually work, to get the orders to do it and figure out how they're going to do it. But say the 1st of April, April Fool's Day. be awful. And it affects DOD and non-DOD. District of Columbia loses a whole lot of jobs, but those mainly live in the suburbs. They go home and the disease spreads. This is reported by where you work and not where you live. So this is awful. I don't think it's going to happen, but we are going to have cutbacks. And so we've worked out earlier in the year, we worked out an alternative scenario. Now this is a little optimistic, I'm going to have to admit. I didn't want to admit this, but I've learned more since I've done this. But this makes the point. Their federal government over there, it's just not growing. It has grown 8% per year on average for the last 10 years, and it's now stopped. Going from 8 to 1, it's 1% last year. Going from 8 to 1 feels like a car wreck. You just hit a stationary wall going 3 miles an hour, and you notice it. This feels like a recession. We still grow, and so when we talk about the role of federal spending, that we're going to have cutbacks, the cutbacks are from growth, not from what we have. I think we're going to keep more or less of what we have, but we're clearly not going to get very much more. And clearly, when it's 40% of your economy, not getting more of that has ramifications. The economy's going to grow instead of growing at 4% per year on average, as it has over the whole region. It's going to grow at 3 or 2.8. It's going to make a difference. Now, this is really scary. This is the federal workforce, and I have 2 forecasts that I buy forecasts from people that have big staffs and charge me money and everybody else for this stuff. The District of Columbia buys forecasts from the same people. But I had one from March of 11. That's that far left-hand column where you're facing. And I have a new one. So this is post-recession. This is just change in federal budget policy. And here you can see the numbers aren't so different at 10. If you look across, the 10 and 12 aren't so different. That's about where we were in July of this year, the newest one. And all of a sudden, in just a couple of years, we're down 15,000 jobs. And then I take it through 2020, we're down another 9,000. We're 24,000 fewer workers in the federal. I have a forecast from 2008 that had us at 465,000 federal jobs by 2030. Obviously, that was before the recession. I don't even show you that because that would want to make you cry. This is our second largest source of jobs. And so whether we grow 1% on procurement or payroll, hopefully we're going to do better than that. That isn't keeping up. That is on top of inflation, but it isn't very much. And this is coming about by a flat budget and by slowly substituting lower entry-level people who are lower. They're well paid, but they're not starting at 100 grand. They're starting at 65 or whatever they start at. So there's this change in the demography, what you heard about last year, this change in the demographic pattern is really important. So I'm going to say a little bit about that too, because it needs to be reinforced, and it is really critical for what some of you do in your philanthropy. So all of this changes. We have an overlay in some ways. You can't. This is getting difficult, I know, for most of you. But let me point out what's really important. I've taken out sort of the current decade and then the one beyond. And I do this because the current decade, which we're all well into now, man, just think it's 2013. And so for the next 7 years, the changes that I see front and center in the economy are happening now. And if they hadn't happened, we would be at the same place more or less in 2030. A little, not quite, but the big change comes early, and then as we move into the second decade, a lot of this stuff becomes less important. So the challenge is up front on this. And it shows up this way. Age 25 to 34, growing 18% this decade, growing 7.6% next decade. Big change. And I compare what age groups are growing faster than the average. It's all on that, or slow, or in this one case, declining. 25 to 34, who are they? Well, they're Generation Y, but that's where all your immigrants are. That's where your movers are. College kids We get net in-migration from every major metropolitan in the United States. More people moving here than going back. We get data every year from the IRS that says, where did you pay your taxes this year? Where did you pay them last year? Back 22 years. We have a net flow. A lot of us came from other places. And we stay. Some of us go back at some point. These are the movers. And they came in, they're coming now. Actually, they came during the recovery. They're coming now, but it looks like they're not going to be as likely to come into the future for various reasons. 45 to 50, I mean, that is the core. That's the bottom end of the baby boomers, the younger baby boomers, declining this decade. They're not coming, or they're moving away. And then everybody knows, we heard it, those over 65, we're the lucky ones. Lots of company, growing dramatically. But you can put all sorts of social needs or demands onto the population. So we have an aging population. Think what that says about the workforce. Who's going to do the work we need to have done when you have this kind of... Every other age cohort is growing slower than the average. That's why I didn't put it up there. Now, this is clearly beyond your ability to fathom. So let me tell you what, these are jobs. And that very top row, if you can break it out, the 16% is really, that's what our job growth is. It's growing faster than population. Population was only growing a little less than 15%. So we're still adding more people, more jobs than we're adding people, which puts more and more demand on the workforce. We can't waste a single age-eligible person in the workforce. And what's going to grow the most? Well, professional business services. That's good. That's where the money is. Those are college graduates or more. That's good. Health and education, but it doesn't continue growing. It's not projected to grow. There's a surge in this. And then state and local government, leisure and hospitality, retail, trade, almost not growing at all, but all growing more slowly. So, and I've already, the federal government's shrinking. So when we look around for horses to ride in the next race, there are not a whole lot that jump off the page. Health, education and health, certainly. Professional business services, we have to pay attention to those. But we don't have an automatic ride to becoming what we're going to become next, which in my mind is going to be a global business center. We're going to have to work at this with a strong government base. London, just think London or Tokyo. They have federal governments, but they have other stuff. Unfortunately, we have New York up the road that takes some of that stuff or keeps it. Labor force participation rates is really important. That's that LF down there for those of you who can see it. 70% in 2010. Nationally, it was only 64%. We have a very high labor force participation rate here. We have more two-wage earner households than any other metropolitan area. We work. But it's declining. It's dropping 4 points or almost this decade. That's because we're aging. Fewer labor force participation rates go down when you're 70, when you're 60. They're not as high. We have the highest labor force participation rates in the U.S. for every age cohort. People come here to work. But now we have fewer people coming. And we're aging, even though 20% of our 70-year-olds and over are still working full-time, and only 10% nationally. At some point, then say that enough is enough. Unemployment is going down. That's good. Still 151,000 unemployed workers at the end of this decade. These are people who want to work and can't find a job. We need every one of them. Unemployment rate, 4.4%. Metropolitan, that's for the whole metropolitan area. It's a full point lower than what it, or 2 points lower than what it is in 10, but a point lower than what it is now. That's good. We're going to still have 151,000 unemployed people in 15 years, 17 years. So in any event, even though some conditions are getting better, they remain a challenge. And finally, the last data piece for you to think about is income. It's hard to understand what's going on here, but I think the key takeaway is the bottom line. That's median household income. Adjusted for inflation, it's only projected to go up 4.4%. The rest of the economy, and the other takeaway is that we're increasingly dependent on unearned income. That's retirement income, transfers, living off of assets. That comes with an aging population, but it means less disposable income. That's gone from 65% to 61%. Then it stabilizes. A lot of stuff's going on this decade. We don't have time to talk about it all. And I'll summarize in a minute. So what's the future going to look like? I'm trying to keep track of time. Here we go. So slower economic growth in the short term through this decade. I think we can understand why. Slow population growth in the long term. We are going to slow down going forward. We have been outperforming the U.S. on population growth because of immigration, foreign-born persons moving in, a more diversified workforce in population, which is a real asset, and people moving here from the rest of the country. An aging resident population has that has important implications, both positive and negative. Income growth slows. And that's this compression I was talking about earlier. At the top end, we're not growing as many high-end jobs. We're continuing to grow quite a few $35,000 to $60,000 jobs. In some places, these numbers sound really good. When a really good job is $35,000 in a lot of rural areas around the country. But here it doesn't do it. You need 2 jobs. And then job growth is going to be driven by the private sector, not the public sector, and then it'll show up probably in 3 categories. The leisure and hospitality, it's always been an important sector here. And it contributes, each job there contributes about $50,000 to the total economy, not salary, but job plus markup. And health and education, about $60,000, professional business services, about $160,000. There are big differences. So we have our economy and maybe the social fabric being defined even more in groups at the bottom half and the top half, but there's a middle half. That doesn't add up, but there's a middle part that's not doing so well. And what's going to happen when we get done here is we move through into 14, 15, 16, that we're not going to be growing as fast as the U.S. We have a history of outperforming the national economy. We've lost our edge. What has made us special is no longer it's a drag. We have headwinds instead of tailwinds. And the rest of the economy is going to we're going to look like the rest of the economy in some ways, at least performance-wise. Now, and when we move a little bit further along, rather than 40% of our economy being federal, it's going to be 36. And by 2020, it's going to be another couple of points less. I haven't figured it out. Health and education picks up 1.5 points. The hospitality sector picks up a little bit, a couple tenths. Non-local businesses, 2 points. We're going to diversify. It's going to take a long time. And so if we had this meeting in 2020, we'd look back and say, well, we're partway there. But we have to get from here to there. And so these are some of the challenges that I would leave you with. I think you have to accept the fact that government, whether it's state, local, or federal, isn't going to be the player it used to be. We know this is coming, so I'm not telling you anything special here. I think the aging of the resident population and how that affects the workforce is a critical issue. You know it's coming, but we forget it because it happens one day at a time. The jobs we're growing have lower incomes, just put it that way, and then we're underperforming. The strength of our economy is underperforming. And so what do we do about this? Where do I see, how do we make this economy competitive? So in 2020, 2030, we realize our potentials. I see it as workforce. It's about the workforce, and it's about housing, and it's about health. It's that simple. It's all things that you all pretty much focus on already. But when I look at we're only generating about 1/3 from natural sources, children that are here, and if they stay here, if they grow up and go to work here, it only meets about 1/3 of our workforce requirements. We have to import workers. We can't waste anybody who's here, therefore. Everybody is important. So clearly I'm telling you stuff that everybody else has already mentioned. We got to improve our completion rates or graduation rates, K through 12, and we have to make it more relevant. You have to teach people skills that they can use in the workplace. We have to, it's been a luxury to, I hate to tell people they shouldn't study philosophy. It's wonderful. Read it on your own time. Or journalism. It's great, you know, but you gotta find some skills you can put to work. And we have to do it starting very early. The workforce development, I'd focus on upskilling the current workforce. There's a bunch of people bailing out at the top over the next 15, 20 years. Just think what 2020, 2025 is, and that is the tsunami of the retirements for the baby boomers. And we will not have enough workers to replace them. And so people will be moving up very quickly into jobs they may not be prepared for. There'll be wonderful opportunities there for good jobs for people who might be cut out because of their skills level. So upskilling the current workers, and the unemployed aren't going back to work unless we prepare them for the new job. So that, I don't know who's doing that, but we're not doing it enough. And then I think we just have to worry about the health and fitness of our population. And we hear a lot about that. I don't know how to do it, but we need some incentives so people exercise and eat better. And the key to the success is being able to house the future workforce. The future workforce has different housing requirements than their parents. They're going to be renters. They're going to get married later. They're going to have fewer kids. They're going to save money. They're worried about their retirement. They're not going to own as many cars. They don't know how to cook. They don't need the same kind of housing that everybody else. And we need to put housing where people can get to work without spending an hour or two and all their money. So I'm going to leave you with that. If you can see the very top line on that, this presentation is there already. RAG can put it on their website, or if you want it, we can send it to you.